How did Indonesia become the country with the largest Muslim population? With almost 280 million people, Indonesia has the world's fourth biggest population, and with close to 90% of Indonesians being Muslim, it easily has the world's largest Muslim population. There are roughly 245 million Muslims in Indonesia, with 99% of them being Sunni. The vast majority live in the heavily populated areas of Java and Sumatra, which are amongst the world's most densely populated islands. Indonesia is an interesting case study, because Islam arrived there without a conquest. Unlike territories of North Africa or Middle East, which are all conquered by Muslim armies, Indonesia was introduced to Islam by traders from the Middle East. From there, the religion spread organically from west to east, across the archipelago. Archaeological evidence of Islamic artifacts dates back to the early 13th century. However, it's likely that Indonesians were aware of Islam well before that. While historians are yet to fully understand how exactly Islam found its way to Indonesia, most agree on several likely scenarios. Because of Indonesia's strategic location amongst major sea routes, Muslim traders are thought to have gradually introduced the concept of Islam to Western Indonesians. Sea trade was a major form of livelihood for Indonesians, as the island landscape offered little in way of cultivation. It made sense to form a strong bond with the well-connected, mostly Arab traders, and many Indonesians opted to convert to Islam. As far as how Islam spread across the archipelago, historians have had to rely more upon guesswork. Here's what we do know. Prior to the spread of Islam, Indonesian religion was primarily influenced by either Hinduism or Buddhism. However, as the archipelago began to interact more and more with Muslim traders, Islam became an increasingly popular option. A 13th century tombstone on the coast of Sumatra is one of the earliest signs of an Islamic presence in Indonesia. Sultan Malik al-Salih's tombstone recorded his death in 1297, after he formed Indonesia's first Islamic state in the mid-13th century. In 1292, Marco Polo also noted Muslim settlements in Sumatra when he stopped off in Indonesia on his way back from China. The Samudra Pasai Sultanate became a kingdom in North Sumatra for several hundred years. Sultan Salih was believed to have converted to Islam in the year 1267, naming his kingdom Samudra from the Sanskrit meaning for ocean. The Islamic kingdoms of Fansur and Lemuri were based in northern Sumatra, and are also thought to have been founded around the same time, in 1250. This is the same period that evidence of Islamic rule was found on the nearby Malaysian peninsula. It all stemmed from when the Arab Muslims began their sea voyages. The Islam era is traditionally thought to have started in the year 610. Muslim traders from the Middle East began exploring and trading from around the mid-7th century. Arab traders had to sail past Indonesia and Malaysia on their way to trade with China. The Malaccan Strait was, and still is, a much-used route by traders, for it was the quickest link between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Arabian Muslims would sail from either the Red Sea or the Persian Gulf into the Indian Ocean, and make their way east, bypassing Indonesia on the way to China. Traders had realized that traveling by sea was faster than the overland Silk Road. There were the dangers of pirates and storms, but the Silk Road trek could take up to a year, while the maritime route was half that. The Muslim Arabs traded spices, silver, and gold for Chinese silk, tea, and paper. Historians have also speculated that many traders were also enticed to Indonesia for its spices, such as nutmeg and pepper. Some of these Muslim traders were captivated by the island's beauty and decided to settle. From here, the indigenous people had their first exposure to Islam. By the 13th century, Muslims almost controlled the international shipping routes, and the Indonesians no doubt looked to the Arab traders and wanted to emulate them. The rise of Islam can further be traced through the first sultanates. By the early 15th century, there were several Muslim kingdoms based around harbors on the main islands of Sumatra and Java. Northern Sumatra is the closest place in Indonesia to where the Muslim trade ships sailed, right on the Strait of Malacca. Nowhere was quite as influential as the province of Aceh, which was the westernmost point of Indonesia in North Sumatra. Aceh was perfectly located to reap the full benefits of trading with the Arab Muslims. It was bordered by the Indian Ocean to the west and the Strait of Malacca to the northeast. The Indonesians in this strategic part of the country quickly realized that converting to Islam would be a tremendous boost to forming a bond with the waves of Muslim traders that were passing by the archipelago. A North African traveler named Ibn Battuta passed through Indonesia in 1345 and 1346 on his way to China. He noted the prevalence of Islam in the area and mentioned that the ruler of Samudra was a follower of the Shafi school of Islam. The Shafi school is one of the 4 religious schools of Sunni Islam and was developed by the teachings of Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi between 767 and 820. For the Indonesians in Sumatra to have had such an advanced understanding of Islam means they learned thoroughly from Muslims in the Middle East. The rich Islamic culture started to pay big dividends for the northern Sumatra region, and the Aceh province in particular. It formed a reputation in Southeast Asia for being a cultural and scholarly center for Islam. This in turn resulted in more interactions with Muslim traders, and by the 15th century, northern Sumatra was exceedingly prosperous. And it wasn't just the Arab Muslim traders that played a pivotal role in spreading Islam throughout Indonesia. Muslim travelers from India and even China were also highly influential. Islam came fairly quickly to India. In the 7th century, Muslims brought it into northern India, and by the early 13th century, the Delhi Sultanate had been established in Delhi. This resulted in a large Muslim population in the southern Indian Bengal region, which was adjacent to the northern coast of Sumatra. Islam also came to China from overland apostles in the late 7th century. Just as with Southeast Asia, Arab Muslims further brought Islamic teachings to China via the often used sea routes. Zheng He was a Chinese admiral in the early 15th century. He was also a Muslim and visited Indonesia several times, mingling with the locals and spreading the word of Islam. He eventually settled down in central Java, where a statue and temple were built, honoring his work and contributions. By the end of the 15th century, Islam had replaced Hinduism and Buddhism as the main religion in Sumatra. The elite and peasant classes had all converted to Islam, with many renouncing their Hindu or Buddhist faith. However, Islam was met with more resistance as it spread east to Java, Indonesia's most populous island. It posed a serious threat to the powerful Hindu-Buddhist Majapahit, which was one of the most powerful in Southeast Asia. Things came to a head in the late 15th century in Java, when the rising Demak Sultanate eventually toppled the long-ruling Majapahit. The Demak Sultanate, founded by Raden Patah, was the first Islamic kingdom in Java. The Majapahit rulers had tried to limit its influence to the interior regions of Java, but the Demak Sultanate just had too many numbers. The Majapahit's days were now numbered, and it relocated further east to Bali as Muslim control spread across Java. The Hindu-Buddhist empires, such as the Majapahit, had never been able to fully unite entire populations. Islam in Indonesia changed this. What began in northern Sumatra soon spread east to Java. It was also done peacefully. Indonesians who converted to Islam tolerated the existence of Hinduism and Buddhism, and all religions were incorporated into society. A big reason for the rapid conversion in Indonesia was due to how Islam was introduced to the Indonesian people. Much of the initial teaching was done via Sufism, a form of Islam that focuses deeply on spirituality and purification. Sufis came to Indonesia from both the Middle East and India, and they brought an accessible brand of Islam. Sufism focuses on finding love and development through a personal relationship with God. This idea of personalizing the religious experience was something that appealed to many Indonesians. The Sufi mystics also took pains to respect the customs and traditions of the indigenous cultures, and offering what appeared to be worthy and lifelong spirituality. The Sufi apostles were able to work their charms in the villages, the courts of the rulers, and of course in the coastal marketplaces. But the majority of Indonesians didn't take much convincing. Most people in the coastal areas that prospered from the Muslim trade hardly had to be convinced of the merits of converting to Islam. The spread of Islam was halted, though, with the Dutch takeover that started in the 16th century. The Dutch were enticed to Indonesia by the ample reserves of spices, pepper, and the gold in the hinterland. They set up the Dutch East India Company and assumed control of the archipelago, which lasted until Indonesian independence in 1945. From the start, Dutch rule in Indonesia was tenuous at best. Although the Dutch were tolerant of Islam in comparison to other European colonialists across the world, there were still plenty of conflicts and disagreements. Nonetheless, on the whole, the Dutch were in favor of supporting religious tolerance, and peaceful coexistence was far more preferable than violent conquest. The Dutch rule ultimately had two main effects on Islam in Indonesia. Global modernization played a part as well. For example, the opening of the Suez Canal in 1869 meant that there were now more regular and faster pilgrimages between Indonesia and the Middle East. Indonesians were becoming more educated about their religion and more interested about how to use it for political gain. Indonesians were now realizing how the unifying power of Islam could help them to overthrow colonial rule and achieve real independence. This was best represented by the formation of the Muhammadiyah political movement in 1912. It was influenced by an Egyptian reform group that sought to enhance the quality of life with Islam. Muhammadiyah's goal was to use Islam for nation building. The organization focused on promoting healthcare, education, and community goodwill. Economic pursuits and entrepreneurship were encouraged, which has always been a key part of Islamic philosophy. This would ultimately bond the archipelago's Muslims and lay the foundation for Indonesian independence. From here came more meaningful exchanges with the global Muslim community, more investment, and more growth. Indonesia has since continued to grow, culturally, economically, and spiritually. The Muslim influence on Indonesia can be looked at as having three stages. First was the initial contact during the initial few hundred years of Islam. After the introductory wave of Islamic influence came its gradual spread. This was initiated by an indigenous ruler deciding to convert, with his subjects following. The third stage came later, in the 19th century, with movements such as Wahhabism and Salafi. These movements originated in the Middle East and led to the spread of a strong form of Islam. This also came with the Industrial Revolution, which brought new technologies, such as steamships, railways, and the mass printing of documents and papers. This both opened up educational and travel opportunities around the world. Muslims from Indonesia were now able to venture to the Middle East and visit Mecca in person.